Good afternoon, everyone. Today we're gathered to celebrate and learn more about Ivan Depeña's impressive sculpture, Breaking Barriers, which was commissioned by the University Museums at Iowa State University as part of the Art on Campus collection. Spanning several years leading up to this anniversary year of 2023, Depeña collaborated closely with a public art committee to bring this powerful sculpture to life, ensuring that it serves as a lasting tribute to the legacy of Jack Trice. The committee comprised representatives from various groups such as ISU Athletics, the Iowa State Student Body, University Museums, the ISU Alumni Association, Facilities Planning and Management, the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, and the University Museums Advisory Committee. Members included myself, Dr. Amy Kalita, Dr. Jeffrey Johnson, Chris Jorgensen, Steve Melcho, Dr. Reginald Stewart, Marie Beecham, Sydney Marshall, John Harvey, and Lynette Pullman, some of whom were also members of the Jack Trice Commemoration Committee. The acquisition of Breaking Barriers was made possible thanks to the Joyce Tomlinson Brewer Fund for Art Acquisition, the Office of the President, the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, and the Iowa State University Department of Athletics. Ivan Depeña, a highly accomplished artist, is currently based in Charlotte, North Carolina, having previously lived and worked in Miami, Florida, and New York, New York. Depeña brings a wealth of experience in art, architecture, technology, and design to his artistic practice. Depeña's unique perspective shines through his diverse range of artistic media. Notably, he has created numerous installations of public art, showcasing his commitment to creating impactful works that engage with the community. His works have been exhibited extensively, both nationally and internationally, in solo and group exhibitions, and can be found in esteemed private and public collections, such as the Colorado Regional Transportation District, Ohio State University, and the Nashville International Airport. Today's Artist Talk with Ivan Depeña is made possible through the Kathy and John Howell Art Enrichment Program. We're grateful for their generous support, which allows us to continue fostering intellectual and artistic growth within our community. Now I'll turn it over to Ivan.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. And thanks again for everybody, for ISU, for having me here to work through and talk about some of the process that went into making the sculpture. I think that was a kind of an important sort of topic to review. Everybody kind of saw it there. And it's such a monumental piece that I think it'll be interesting to kind of walk through and talk a little bit more about how it was made, how the ideas were generated, and finally how it was installed. So again, thank you. So a little bit about the project. I don't think it's any surprise that Jack Trice is not a secret. He's pretty well known around campus, given various forms of commemoration. However, it's been about 100 years since the tragic event in 1923, coming up in about a little less than a couple of weeks, right? Yeah. So throughout the century, Jack Trice has been both revered and endeared on and off campus for nearly a century, and his identity has been present here. And I think that's an important aspect to kind of ponder a little bit, this this idea of someone being present and absent at the same time. So that's a good majority of what sort of came into fruition as I was dealing with how to commemorate somebody that was so powerful throughout the history of the university. So generally, I was obviously honored to create a sculpture to memorialize the student, the athlete, and the icon. So myself, having a personal history coming from mixed race and ethnicity, these are topics that are both hit home for me and have a certain level of sensitivity. I think generally, I think it's super important to understand and realize that there's a major issue and concern even in contemporary society today, yesterday, the day before, super close to everybody's heart and everybody's thoughts. So I wanted something to, conceive of an experience that actually was both timeless and also dealt with the issues that are still evident today. So, this sort of dichotomy and surfacing, but at the same time not being, over the top and too brash or abrupt. So there was a delicate line that I wanted to kind of deal with as I was working through the sculpture. So let me move on a little bit and talk a little bit about the, a few of the important concepts and inspiration that persisted while both sketching and brainstorming in this process. Some of the initial thoughts I had in terms of just, first of all, it was my first realized memorial as a sculpture. So giving a substance, a definition, a sort of, reflection on someone's life. I didn't take it very lightly, obviously. But some of the early thoughts that came to mind were, I remember a series of sculptures by Michelangelo that stood out to me from my undergraduate studies. They were the title series. It's either some people call them the prisoners or slaves, and the idea is where there were variations of level of sort of completion in these sculptures, but at the same time they revealed a process, and they also sort of poetically showed the encapsulation or the imprisonment of a figure within the material itself. I found it very interesting that the chisel marks were still revealed, and that sort of almost became scars, became part of the anatomy. These are a couple of other ones, the awakening slave and the young slave. So this idea of process was something that was very important to me, and how these were made, the sort of revealing of how Michelangelo worked through, carving these figures out of stone. There's some pretty famous adages about how, the figures reveal themselves from the actual material themselves, and this particular series caught my attention specifically due to that. There was a sense of longing, let's say, and a sense of sympathy for the figures in the pieces that I felt as a reaction. So, kind of when you see you're used to seeing Michelangelo's finished works, but when you see these objects and these sculptures, for me, my reaction was like, whether or not, like, how would they look like when they were complete? Why, were they stuck in this sort of mass? So that kind of crept into my mind. The finished versus the unfinished. So that, eventually Michelangelo's sculptures are quote unquote released from their materiality, and they were freed from their, initial state of mass. So this is something that, again, I was very interested in pursuing. I'm just going to briefly talk about these. This is a sculpture by Bruce Nauman, one of the first, aside from, both of these are also, again, dealing with the idea of presence and absence and completion and incompletion. Very importantly for me, one of the conceptual works by Bruce Nauman from my early memory and my studies was this, a cast of the space under the chair, right? So it was very, very interesting to me that the sculpture was created from the negative space, right? Things that weren't there, the object, the memory of the object itself. So it was a real focus on what was not there while providing this object of mass. Following along those same lines, Rachel Whiteread, House in 1993. So if you take a look at this piece, it's essentially the cast of the interior space of a home in England. It's in a park, or it was in a park. It's no longer there, but so this idea of the interior space and the revealing of the articulation of the door frames, the windows, every piece of material. There's a recent series that she's done, there's bookshelves, so she does the casting of the books and then removes the book, so all you see is essentially the void of the space of where the book was. So again, all of these things talking about, they didn't all come to me at once. It was just, just bringing these things to light and kind of dealing with. It's easy to sort of in retrospect, come up and say, okay, fine, this is exactly how it happened in what sequence, but it's not necessarily the case. For instance, this sculpture, this sketch came to me. It was one of the early sketches, and it's one that stuck through, obviously. So this was a textbook sort of insomnia situation where in the middle of the night, you're antsy, you can't sleep, and I'm like thinking about, how can I do this? What can come up, and how can I make an impactful yet simple gesture that relates an idea straight across. So it came to me that night. I started sketching it, and then so this breaking out of a white form, a white cube, was the sort of initial concept. I should mention that for a good portion of the first phase, and we'll talk about this, and I'll show you quite a bit more in the slides coming up, but the design development part, there was intended to be a figure running out of the sculpture. I'm giving you a little bit of, I'm kind of revealing the conclusion in a sense, but there was a lot of process given to thinking about this figure. So I want to go in and talk about how that came to be. So the next few slides I'm going to show are variations on what was studied. How to encapsulate, how to embody Trice's visage, his form. There was various information on his actual, anatomy was kind of hard to come by, so we dove into the images of Trice and, got his shoe size and felt really close to the actual silhouette we got from the images, and those were then processed via computer to start to think about these ideas of motion, of power, of breaking free, the sort of dynamic quality of the figure of the athlete running, through the field during gameplay. A lot of thought was given to being sensitive about how the actual action that led to his injuries could be alluded to, but not necessarily, represented directly. So this is a defensive player running from, the moment of essentially where the play breaks and, people run towards each other. This is a defensive mode. And, we played with a lot of different gestures walking through this process. So the form itself, once we got the massing right and we felt how the volume was at the correct moment, it's an abstraction, so it's not literally meant to be represented as a figurative sculpture, right? It's more, I guess it is in a sense, but at the same time, there was no representational qualities that I wanted to get across, essentially. I wanted just this idea of an abstract form through space. So how to make it appear dynamic, what material could we use, this idea of slicing the figure in various ways to show both, again, and I'll show you a little bit more, this idea of motion and just the power of the athlete was something that I was very interested in trying to relay. And as you can see, it was not an easy process for me there was a lot of moments where it was just like, wow, this one's good, but it's not quite there. So there was a lot of toiling and time spent in trying to figure out these exact methodologies. So does a solid figure show the energy and the power and the force and the dynamism that was intended? If we striated it, if we cut them into planes, do the verticals work better than the horizontal striations? Is it a full form, one form, or do they compound? So when I say compound, I mean imagine stretching a moment of time, and I'll show you a little bit more of that. So this is the striations and the levels and the layers and the sort of a topographical map, so to speak, of somebody running through space. I found these very interesting, and as we talked, I was working with the committee. They've seen all of these variations working through the design development process. And for me, something wasn't clicking. Although these were very interesting visually, the sliced iteration was, I thought it was a nice way of showing something that's visible and yet invisible at the same time, depending on where you're standing and your point in space. So that sort of absence and presence idea was coming through quite a bit here, but there was something wasn't clicking. So these are the compounded shapes that started to lead to something a little bit more substantial in terms of for what I thought was worth following. And what we did was we used the computer animation, so this was getting closer to the final iteration. So the compounded form was generated using a 3D model, actually animated, and taking several frames, let's say 20-something other frames, and stitching those together some way, using the computer to form the mold of that gesture, of that motion. So these, for me, I felt like were almost spot on in terms of what I wanted to kind of relay in the process. And I like the idea of kind of returning to, the Michelangelo and the encapsulation and the freezing of time. However, making these proved pretty complicated. So thinking about how to go about actually producing these and whether or not the budget allowed for it, there was a lot of different conversations about what was possible. Some of these are probably, as you can see, if anybody's in the design realm or the art realm or somebody into making form, there's a lot of undercuts and a lot of things that would be impossible to sort of, build in real life without great trials. So we started thinking about how to convert this back into the idea of the slices. So I'll show you a couple of other renderings that evolve around that idea. But so the stitching it together of the frames, I felt this was very powerful. It actually showed the motion in a sense that relayed originally to the concepts. Various early iterations. So these are thinking about whether or not how the figure worked. Did the solid figure work, better? You started putting them in the physical space, thinking about scale. What would work? What can we afford? What would the process be? What would the material be? So these are going to show variations on what ideas were there before the final decision was made. So again, you can see these figures kind of disappearing. Another technical sort of fabrication issue, or the complexity of how to make these things, was also brought, into light. And I'm not saying that I shied away from these because they were complex. In the end, it was essentially the idea of the simplicity, what we brought back to, because what's actually there was pretty complex to make as well. So thinking about whether it's running away from the stadium, whether the figure's running to the stadium, what the materiality would be, how is there a way to bring in the idea of his letter that he wrote before the game, the I will, and the famous kind of call to arms and the force, bringing to that idea. How can we bring that out there? The scale, could it be too intimidating? Could it be, there was a lot of discussion about what the right moment was. And again, there were moments of eureka, like, wow, this could be really incredible. But there's something that still kept kind of not making it quite right for me. And you can see, do we incorporate it into the wall? Do we show the wall literally in the figure breaking through of Trice? Can the wall be glass? That was discussed. There was a lot of different sort of iterations and studies that were done to get to the conclusion of where we are today and what you see now in front of the stadium. So this one's just showing a compounded, figure running. what the horizontal striations could look like. This looked a little bit, perhaps too Terminator, a little too sort of melted figure. Didn't seem. There were certain things that, again, just didn't sit right in terms of how the commemoration and the memorialization of Trice, should be for me. We talked a lot about during the process of this study is the constructability. What was the cube made of? And the initial sketch was really wanted it to be a solid form, something that was like a massive piece that felt somewhat indestructible, but at the same time showing the figure running through that was destructible. There, historical representations of sculptures in the past that I wanted this monumental sort of volume to exist in both a minimal sense. So the early studies, there was a lot of seams, there was a lot of detail that, like, how can we make something appear massive, right? And it always felt a little bit too Disney-like, I think, in the way that things were portrayed. It was just more, there was a lot of sort of faking, to try to get an idea across. So that didn't, again, sit right with me. Could we cut out the negative space of the, I'm not sure if you see my cursor, but, could that be slotted into the cube and show that movement and that sort of frame by frame or frame per second ideology, again, covered. And then the conclusion, where we wound up. Sort of this idea, again, of being there and not being there. The remembrance, the memory, the absence, but at the same time, the feeling that power of a minimal gesture. And I think that's where we wound up getting to, is just like how I wanted it to be a minimal moment where it embraced the ideas pretty much simultaneously. So then talking about how to make that, how do we do it? And I can get to that process. So that I'm just showing lots of different iterations based on these ideas. Where the seams would occur was another idea, where if we have to make this massive box, this thing, how is it going to be transported? Is it going to fit on a trailer? There's a lot of practical issues, right? It was a 12 by 12 cube of what wanted to be stone, so that's not like. And I should mention that the final that's out there now weighs about 240,000 pounds. So figuring a way to get that from the fabricator, pull it off, and I'll show you the slides here to get a little bit more talked about. So the fabrication. So we decided how do we make this cube in the least amount of parts and have it come together and feel solid, right? So there is a capacity for a trailer to go down the road, and that is roughly 80,000 pounds. And that includes the weight of the truck. So we had to figure out a way to put one of these blocks on a truck and actually have it pass the weigh pieces. So it worked out to 6 pieces at roughly 40,000 pounds apiece. This here shows the part of the process where it's a cast. So this is the part that was made first, and I'll show you that. And then there is the part that was formed, the actual material. So this is a cast stone. It was decided on by a company named Artstone that, I believe, Lynette, did you recommend them to us, or somebody from the university? Yeah, that's right. They've used before, and it worked out pretty marvelously. So that's the process. We made the positives first, and then cast the negative from that. So the initial positive was made out of foam, and I could show you that. And excuse me, the foam was milled using robotic technique, which I'll show you in a second. So all of these ideas of working with this computer-aided technology to actually get the form to look as fluid as we wanted to. So this is anybody that's out there in the architecture world or design or sculpture, this is a program called Grasshopper and Rhino. This is the 3D modeling software, and this is a parametric coding software that goes in and essentially helps model and provides the tooling paths and creates sort of from the programming language to the actual form. So there's a dialogue that gets formed there from these two things technically. I don't want to dig too deep into it, but I just wanted to show you a little bit under the hood of what that looks like on our computer screen, for instance, while we're working on it. So this is a company named Outshaped, close to Minneapolis, Minnesota. They were capable of carving these large pieces of foam using their robotic techniques. So these again came in pieces, modular pieces that were then put together and assembled. So all of these tooling marks were done by the robot, straight from our computer model, as you saw in the earlier slides. Using the process uses a rough bit first, and then that's to get out the major parts of the foam, and then it goes in and it smooths it out a little bit, and then in the end it's done by hand. I should mention that there is, if you notice, that if you go to the sculpture, on the inside there's a really smooth, well, not it's as smooth as stone can get, in that sense, but there was a sense to keep that exterior in its rough initial state and have the form be very fluid and clean. This is another image, showing the kind of initial cuts and how that process of smoothing winds up looking. So then beyond that, there's another level. So these are the foam pieces reached the cast stone location. So when the foam got there, they actually put another layer of plaster on that to make it even smoother, and work that, and essentially just like you would a drywall patch or some kind of, like you put a level of plaster, you sand it, and is it smooth enough? It's not, and let's do it again and again. So there was various levels of that that went into the piece. So I wanted to show the actual forms that were made. So these are giant wood forms where the foam material gets placed into, and then that's where the stone, the liquid stone, it's a cementitious process, which means it's a powder, you add liquid, it becomes malleable, then you're able to pour it into the form, and then it solidifies, and then you have to remove the initial positive form. So this is the case, this is making the box. As you can see, the volume and the scale of each one of the pieces is pretty substantial. And there's a lot of reinforcement because, again, this was 40,000 pounds of cast stone that went into this. This is the material getting ready to be cast, is poured in. So you can see now, if you think about the sculpture and you remember, the arm is absent in the sculpture, right? So this is the piece that's actually it was made from the negative space that was there. So what you see, the emptiness there, is actually what winds up being the stone itself. So this is the removal of the foam. As you can see, it looks fun. So they're all covered in styrofoam. Wish they were wearing masks, but they're not. And yeah, some more, sort of blowing and chiseling and sanding and getting that foam out of there. As you can imagine, if you've seen the piece, obviously, that it's kind of hard to get into those nooks and crannies. And the finished pieces being finalized in terms of the texture. Here you can notice pretty obviously that the desired texture for the outside was one of roughness, and the texture for the inside wanted to be more smooth. These were also designed and engineered to be able to be picked by a crane. So the actual structure inside of these has built into it these hooks on top, so a crane could actually lift it vertically and then swing it into place. And that's the same way they get laid down into the truck is the way they get picked off. And I should mention also, and I don't have an image of this, but there's a ton of reinforcement in here to keep this thing together. So that reinforcement is the steel bars that are kind of wrapped into a mesh and made into a volume inside of this to keep it together. The cleats, something I wanted to talk about. So the impression of Trice running through the hardscape and the pavement there was something I thought was very important to the concept. So not removing altogether, but leaving the footsteps behind, as a memory, as a remembrance, and casting the word "I will" into those. So this is another variation. So thinking about, again, this absence and presence, and it was all built into the process as well. Like the mold making is essentially a metaphor for that in and of itself, right? You start with something that eventually disappears and becomes the exact sort of yin-yang moment of it. So these are the cast for the "I will." The company was called Carolina Bronze. That's closer to us. So we sent them a computer model of the cleat, and we embossed or debossed the text, and they made the casts out of clay first, and then they did a latex mold, and then they poured bronze to make those footsteps that are now embedded in the pavement. So talking a little bit about the installation, I'm not sure how many people here may or may not have seen it, but there was a very interesting process seeing these big pieces come together. The company that we used is called Seedorf, and I wanted to just show you how these pieces came off of the truck. So there it is floating, and then it gets craned over, laid down where one of the latches gets removed, and the cables, and then it swings vertically, and then it floats into place. So these are all the pieces laid out when they took them off the truck, because they had to do several trips, as I mentioned. So each truck came, and there was a caravan. Truck came, pieces were unloaded, set down, and then they picked them from the locations and put them all into place one by one. The guts, let's say, the main core of the installation happened within, I would say, 12 hours that day. There was a lot of fine tuning finally, but it started really early in the morning and moved through. So getting these pieces into place was no small feat either. There were shims put in. As you can imagine, when these things are in cables, you have 40,000 pounds of cast stone kind of floating around in the air. You definitely don't want your fingers in there. But at the same time, we want to place them precisely. So there were posts and anchors that were placed on the bottom. So these were cored out, and then there were posts that basically helped these pieces fit into a puzzle, so they landed right. And there was still a little give, and there was movement, and that's what I was there to drive them crazy about. Quarter inch this way, like an eighth of an inch that way. And the guy's like, No, but seriously, Seedorf did a good job. They were very patient with me, and us as we were there. So these are the pieces coming into place, and you can get an idea of what the inside of this looks like without it being together as a whole. Conceptually, there was a crack in the piece, which was both done for a practical reason and conceptual reason, where the piece is actually breaking apart, but at the same time having that seam in the middle, that sort of fissure that goes through the piece, helped us break it into 6 pieces that were workable. So this crane was also about 3 stories, 4 stories tall in order to get it to swing in the right direction and put it in the right location. I wanted to give you an idea of what one felt like going into place. So again, meticulous placing and shimming and making sure that these pieces lined up correctly was an undertaking, to say the least. But in the end, as seeing these things come together, it was moments like this where it was just like, wow, the idea is no longer on paper, it's coming to form and to fruition, and it's actually happening in a way that's really, satisfies the original intent. And this is the drilling of the posts that I was speaking of earlier, so those came out, and we kept a lot of those cores and gave them to some of the family and kept them here too. I thought this shot was interesting, showing the outside and the inside simultaneously. You'll never see it again like that, but it's kind of a revealing process of what that process was. So some more, this is towards the end of the day, this is the last piece being placed. And you can see some of the really nice light coming through. And I thought this was a moment that was really, where everything was literally coming together. The light, the shadow, the form, the construction, the installation, it was really sort of an emotional moment for myself and the team. And then nighttime. So I should mention this image for me, as I was developing the form and creating the idea and sort of this geological metaphor started to come to light. Like it really felt like one of those windblown caverns or Anderson Valley? Is that, or am I making that?
Yeah,
Anderson Canyon? Antelope. Yeah, because we went there, and I was like, wow, this feels a lot like Trice, and I'm thinking to myself, well, maybe Trice feels a lot like Antelope Canyon. But yeah, the thought of being inside of this piece and actually inhabiting it and walking through was a major component of the initial design process and thought process. Something I did not mention before, but this level of being able to interact with the piece and walk through it and experience, sort of, again, more metaphorical, walking in the footsteps, but at the same time feeling the presence of, a literal giant through the space, I thought was, something important worth mentioning in this talk. It's a really important element of the piece. So these are some final installation images. I'll just breeze through these because I'm sure you guys, you have them right there. The photos don't do it justice in terms of scale, but just playing with the light, I think, was a very important element in these pieces. How it carves through, how you see the stadium through it, the silhouette, again, the absence, the memory, all of these sort of emotional components that go into the piece itself. I felt like, in my opinion, was very successful from sketch to completed project. I was very happy and very proud of the work. Here you get a little bit of sense of the scale, the relationship to the athletics building, the relationship to stadium, and again some more of the shadow, light shadow play, some details of the piece. Again, very, very geological, very monumental. The final cast. And then this is taken from last year's homecoming, but this is actually showing people walking through it. And I was really, really happy to see the actual usage of the piece. And I felt that was, again, another emotional moment where it's like, wow, it's actually working. And there's more info on me if you guys are interested in seeing any of that. My website and my social media handle are there. And that's all. I'd like to open it up for questions or discussion, and if anybody wants to talk about it more. Yes, go ahead.
I have a question. So in your original drawings, how you came up with the idea, we went through a lot of early ones. When you mentioned the idea of making it into the white cube. But at what point did you come up with the idea of putting the craft in it? Like the early drawings that slide didn't have that. So
So there's a compound answer to that. One was when we were making the form itself and designing it and looking at it in 3D, for me, there was not enough sort of breaking away. There wasn't a moment of actual fracture where you felt that the cube was busted through. So it was like two things came together really wonderfully. And then, as I mentioned, we had to split this thing into 6 pieces. So there's those two things actually melded pretty perfectly.
Is that what Bob Ross would call a happy accident?
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Right, because to me, that, the whole idea gives it the movement, which is great, gives it the monument, the scale that you need, and the crack in it is what really brings it together,
Yeah.
this concept about Jack Trice.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, the crack was initially meant to be carved into it, but that sort of slice, I think when you're in it and it reveals a little bit of the sky, it's also another, for me, a kind of a poetic moment of, looking into the ether and having that revelation of what you're actually in, So yeah, thanks. That's a good point. Definitely an accident and also happy. Yeah.
So having worked with you for the install, and being at that homecoming game, this is the fastest I've ever seen a public art get lore or legend associated with it. And people walking through just touching and feeling and reverence. But I heard multiple times from multiple people that it's a sundial. And that was never mentioned. So I don't know how you feel about that people are seeing it kind of like a sundial as the sun pours through.
I haven't heard that, actually, the sundial aspect.
Lots of people,
But-
and I don't know if somebody made a mistake at some point in news coverage and called it a sundial.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
I hope
it's
it,
the quickest lore I've
I hope
ever seen.
I hope it keeps time correctly.
Yeah. I said, how does that work?
I did want, the use of light and the sun is something in my work, and if you see some of my other projects, that's always there. I like for the piece to evolve throughout the day, throughout the month, throughout the year, different shadow, different play, different light. And being, location specific is important, but in this case, it wasn't intended as a sundial, but at the very least, the sun play and the shadow play was hyper important in the entire concept. So I'm glad that at least people are picking up on that relationship. Yeah.
Can you talk in a little bit more detail about how you finally made that decision when you had the 2 main elements? How you decided that the figure wasn't going to work with the, I call it a cube? What do we call it?
Yeah, sure. The
Is that okay?
volume cube,
I don't want
platonic
to
solid. It was a eureka moment, but it was an arduous one at that. Like it was the figure just wasn't working for me. Like and I think Lynette and the team and everybody that I showed it to can feel it. And I was just like, there's something not right. And so we tweaked it like millions of times. And then I was just like, oh, wait, what if you just remove it? And it's like, oh, like all that time. But, I had to go through that process in order to get to that moment. But I am one of those artists that likes to turn over lots of stones in order to get to, and you can ask my team, it drives them crazy. But I feel like it's important to know, even if I return to the original idea, I really do like to kind of iterate and explore. So it wasn't a specific moment, but there was like maybe seeing the model now in retrospect and turning the figure off. I feel like was one of those moments where I was like, oh wait, it's a lot better that way, and it feels, what if it was just footsteps? And I was like, okay, that's it. Done. Yeah. Sure.
Start with the title Breaking Barriers, is that fine, or is that?
Yeah, that actually was in the original sketch. And I'm terrible at titles. I'll wait to the last minute, like literally, because I need to sit with it for a while. I definitely have theme words that come through, early on, like things that are inspiring or things that I use as sort of springboards to other ideas, but breaking barriers was kind of there to begin with, yeah. And I don't know if it's in there. I mean, maybe I'll show go back to that sketch quickly. So yeah, it's there. And this helps me kind of do my own looking back and remembering. 'Cause, yeah, I actually thought about it as I was putting this presentation together. That it's one of the ones that the title came relatively soon into the piece.
So can you speak to the cube itself, because it seems like early on that was the shape that you created. So I mean, it could have been any shape really, but why the cube?
I wanted a mass, a volume, like something that represented adversity to get through, right? So we played with shrinking the depth of it, and that didn't work. It just needed to feel like a sort of massive volume, cube, platonic, solid. So yeah, that cube came and went, and then it came back again, because that was another one of those iterative moments where it's like, it's not feeling right, needs that mass. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the sketches.
Thanks. I usually, there's a bunch more, but I figured I have enough process in there for you guys. But this was the eureka moment for me that came to do.
There are other Trice artworks on campus. Did you consider this project in context of those, or try to just pursue this independently?
We toured them, we looked at them. I tried to avoid being derivative in that sense, and I wanted it to be unique. So that's kind of where that launched from. I was aware of the precedent and kind of moved to something a little bit more, less figurative, less representational, and more emotive, so to speak. Yeah, go ahead, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm kind of wondering about, you're talking about it being monumental, and I get that with like the volume. When I'm in it, you're unable to sort of put your arm or hit, like there's this large, he's like blown up and larger than life. And I wondered, I think there's something in there about humanity and like blowing him up in this way. And I was wondering between that and like how your racialization and your masculinity, like if you had anything to say about the humanity, like how you connected with this person. And
See where you're coming from in terms of that. Masculinity, believe it or not, was not on the forefront of my mind in working through this. Like it was one of those moments where I wanted it to be more spiritual and kind of genderless, but I see where you're coming from in terms of that scale ideology. But the scale was there so you could walk through it. It wasn't about like the ingrandation of Trice himself. It was a practical response, but at the same time, I wanted it to feel, in a sense, like that sort of reference to geology. I wanted it to feel like you were walking through a cave. But it's interesting that masculinity comes through, and I know that could be a bad word or it could be a good word in this sense.
I don't think that it's a bad word. I think we're looking at like a case of masculinized and racialized violence, right?
Yeah.
And that is where you would connect with this person.
No, that's a really good read on, and it's an interesting sort of reaction as well. I mean, that's very, very true. And thinking about that, like in terms of making things, like it's always for me a great moment when people interpret things in a special way, in a nice way as well, and impactful is substantial to me to have the artwork kind of live on its own and have different lives for different people. I know that question was not necessarily answered,
It
but
wasn't really a question.
more of a thought. Yeah, no, I mean, surprisingly, like even though being a male athlete and it actually took me a little bit aback because I was like, wow, that is like I never really considered it deeply as a force in there. So for me, it was more about, yeah, like I was saying, the experience and the spirituality of it than anything of that nature. But it's cool. Thank you.
So you talked a little bit about learning Jack Trice's like, shoe size and things like that, because you have the cleat prints that lead up to it. So are those the same size as the actual shoes, or like the larger than life size of?
They were as close to the actual size
Okay.
as
Yeah.
we can sort of imagine. Yeah.
Yeah, and then how did you decide how far apart to put them? Because I've seen lots of people try to like run through and then they can't quite make the last one.
They were placed in. We did various running tests to kind of envision what it would be like to be on the defensive line and break from a stop to a run. So that was pseudoscience, I guess.
No recording to that.
That's not your story?
No. I was the one marking. I'm curious, I saw my son running through it today and trying to catch up to him, and it was neat, like, to see, like, people trying to actually literally walk in or run in the footsteps. So. I couldn't hear you. Sorry, go ahead.
Curious, what changed for you from the time when you didn't know anything about Jack Trice, maybe didn't know anything about Iowa State University? What did you discover about Iowa State community, Jack Trice? What did you discover about yourself as you went through the journey from this is a proposal to it is here, it's a part of Iowa State now for till the end of things?
That's an interesting question, actually. There's a lot of thoughts on sort of racial issues. Those were heavy on my mind throughout. And I wanted to be sensitive but vocal at the same time, as far as making a statement. Learning about, in terms of myself, it did make me think about a lot of ways where my race and ethnicity comes into play in various situations, and how I certain moments feel like I don't belong, in a sense, and it's like, what am I doing here kind of idea, like I shouldn't be here, like with this certain caliber of person. And so there's a reflection on that idea. And, I did learn. I'm constantly learning from this process. I mean, even today, thinking about things in a different perspective than I had intended, I think it's really powerful for me. And I think I should mention that working with Iowa State, I never felt like I didn't belong here. Like I felt like I was actually embraced, and I was put in the position to make this work for a reason. And I think I jumped at that challenge. Just reading about the history in general, like from where it started to where it is now, I think is an incredible story. How important that loss was and what it means to the university today. And it showed me a lot about the staff and the students, actually, and the faculty to work through that. So, yes, various levels of sort of learning and embracing. Yeah, sorry.
I see up there, it looks like possible on the right-hand side, possible LED banding with dynamic input.
Yeah.
So did you consider putting lights on it?
I did.
Okay.
Initially, it being a stadium, I thought I would take some of that contextual element and like slap it on the sculpture and have it be all of a sudden camouflaged and work immediately. But I think after seeing it and then some of the initial interactive piece was like, how can we engage the audience, and see maybe there was a text-based program or something that people could kind of put their reflections on there as well. So if there was a moment where, but I think that as interesting as it could have been, I feel like leaving it well enough alone and was something that I decided to do.
One thing that struck me was talking about the process of this evolving. And you started with Michelangelo, which I've looked a lot into Michelangelo's ideas of how he created the sculptures. He said he didn't create the sculptures. It would have been considered sacrilegious to say, I can take a block of stone, granite, or whatever, and chisel it down, and it's me that created it. He was working, one of the art historians that I worked with here on campus. He said he's using more of the Greek idea of mimesis, the idea that he was simply an agent of God's nature, and that all he had to do was find the sculpture that God had put in the stone to live with the religious and spiritual concepts of the time. Because when I walked through it the first time, my feeling was of particularly areas of national parks where these canyons have been worn. And it seemed to me that however you thought in terms of, well, I'm creating this or I'm making a decision, I thought you had really arrived at a metaphor that on some level for me made sense. And I've always thought of Jack Trice, because I was here when the students started agitating to be had him recognized. And I remember it was like pushing through a stone to get people to pay attention to that story. And all the stories in the United States Daily and everything that I remember during the time I was here seemed to me as if trying to see how natural it is for the first black men here playing sports to express something so natural to him that he didn't think he was doing anything extraordinary. He was just going to represent his race and do the best he could.
Yeah, and those statements in the initial letter that I read were of that nature as well.
I mean, that's the way I tied into it. It was with I think you mentioned the idea of the canyons with worm things, and so I thought that held true on some important level for me, the spiritual part of it.
Well, I'm glad that came of it. And, thinking about the Michelangelo thing as well, I mean, it was part of what I was alluding to earlier, where it's like freeing the form from the stone itself in a sense where, it was not necessarily his hand, it was already kind of there, right? So that's something that I felt like I was interested in having the discussion, and particularly these, where it shows that process, because we're used to seeing the finished work, and that's kind of what I was talking about earlier, where it's like these are encapsulated and stuck, not free yet. But at the same time, all of those things came into play in the discussion, as the ideas were coming forward. So I'm glad you actually got that. The geological thing, it's hard to escape. Once you're in there, it does feel very kind of canyon-like.
I particularly like the one on the right because of the illusions, like to a form, a geometric form that's kind of trapped within and yet trying to get out.
Yeah.
And thinking of a place of former slaves, their ancestors, trying to find a way out of that to be just who they want to be accepted as a human being.
Exactly. That's very well put. Thank you.
Any other questions? Provoked a lot of thought.
Good.
How about a good round of applause?